The Brazilian's rifle sparked in the forest, unleashing deadly curses against the Russians. He was relentless in the fights against the forces of Moscow for years. And only after the third year of war did death finally seek him out for a one-way journey, when the Russian special forces attacked him. Only the rifle, faith, and luck remained, so he wouldn't shake hands with the Reaper. Harrison Benavides Ava. He had such clarity in his plans that he was able to shape his future until he achieved the happiness he had always hoped for. After a fiery path, the costs along the way were high, walking over the corpses of enemies, attending the funerals of friends. There were many times when he saw the faces of compatriots who fell in combat at memorials for the deceased in Ukraine. There were also many moments when he celebrated life and victory, surviving Russian attacks and ending the lives of enemies who stood in the way of his dreams. Harrison arrived in Ukraine early in the war. It was 2022 when there was a promise that the Russians would take over the whole country in just a few weeks. It was still being proclaimed by everyone who said there were no more powerful and well-prepared armed forces on the planet. But arrogance usually comes at a high price, and the ones who paid it were the soldiers on the battlefield. The Brazilian watched this at first, working as a volunteer in humanitarian aid groups, DUSU, and seeing what the Ukrainians suffered with the Russian advance. There were relatives murdered by soldiers, killed by bombings, or forced to flee from the advance of enemy troops. The journey to Ukraine was long. He had his pizza delivery service in Brazil. He was studying food engineering at college in Caxias, in Mato Grosso. His heart wasn't satisfied with that. When the opportunity came up, he dropped everything and went to France, chasing the dream of seeing other countries and living the life of a soldier. At first, he was in the French Foreign Legion, but then the war in Ukraine broke out. He went against the flow of thousands who fled from the Russian advance. He arrived in Ukraine in 2022 in Du. With his heart pounding, feeling the closeness of his dreams, but also knowing the risk of death looming. Soon, he was already in Ternopil, signing his contract with the International Legion of Ukraine. This signature would be accompanied by the war name Parakit Harrison, with the contract signed and the K in hand. He set off for the front, more precisely with the Carpathian Sikh Battalion. The arrival of the mortars near his position made his ears vibrate. The force of the impacts was almost felt on the skin as he and the Latin soldiers hid in the trenches.
With this companion,
Upon hearing the whistling of the explosives approaching, all that was left was to lie down and pray that death didn't have his name on the collection list that day. The tension was palpable in the Brazilian's breathing as he tried to move between the trenches after the barrages destroyed the defenses. Where he was, he ran while shooting to get cover, fearing he was in the sights of Russian rifles. His feet finally stepped into the next trench, relieved to have gained a few more meters towards surviving another day. Later, he joined other Brazilians to fight in the forest of Crimea. Charlie Company, from the 2nd Battalion of Ukraine's International Legion, was sent to hold their position during one of the worst moments of the war in that area. He made his music in the Orchestra of Destruction, conducted by Ivan Kruger, the Brazilian leader of the company. He unloaded his ammunition, protected in the trench and listening to the explosions around him. He picked up the rocket-propelled grenade again to launch new fire strikes against the Russians when he saw that something more than the rifle was needed. There were months of those battles and camaraderie among men, It wasn't easy. The Russians didn't give them any rest. Some made it out alive to other battalions, including one that would become his greatest challenge in Ukraine. Had lived in that empire for 3 years. His soul was still standing, full of scars, but intact. He watched more colleagues return to Brazil, some of them with a sense of accomplishment and with the lesson of having survived for years or months in one of the worst recent wars. He saw some fleeing, also those deluded by the glory of war, and others arrived. And looked at their faces, seeing the full determination to fight for their ideas, or sometimes the illusion of glory for money, which would be shattered by Russian artillery and drones in a few days. He stayed there, starting his family in Ukraine by marrying a Ukrainian woman. He heard about the 60th Brigade fighting in Lyman in those days and decided to change his contract for this new mission. At the beginning of the war between Russia and Ukraine, the brigade was deployed to defend the Dnipropetrovsk region before advancing toward Kherson. From the end of 2022, its soldiers took part in the tough defense of Bakhmut, which continued throughout 2023. During the summer of that year, the unit was repositioned on the border between Russia and Ukraine in the Kharkiv Oblast to contain possible enemy advances. At the end of 2023 and in the first months of 2024, the brigade was directly involved in the defense of Kupiansk, another critical point on the Eastern Front. Shortly after, no later than March 2024, the 60th Brigade was transferred from that sector to operate on the Lyman Front, where Russian military pressure was also intensifying. These were tough battles, in which the Russians put pressure on the 60th and also the 63rd Brigade, hitting their soldiers and equipment with everything they had available. Already in 2025 in Lyman, the drones of the 60 and 63 brigades were chasing the Russians in the open fields and along the tree lines. The enemy armored vehicles had improvised protection to avoid the kamikazes, but the drones came down mercilessly on the vehicles, blowing up the metal. At some point, the armor gave way, turning more Russian tanks and transports into scrap metal. The kamikazes of the 60th Brigade were relentless in their low-flying attacks against the Russians. Each devastating impact against the bodies meant one less soldier able to advance through the tree lines. The Russians' fight against the kamikazes was dramatic. A soldier had few options. After emptying their magazines uselessly against the demon, the only thing left was to try to hit it with their own rifle. The Russian threw his last defense and fell, engulfed by fire. Thus, the Ukrainians were outflanking and halting the enemy offensive on a rough front. The drones were there even at night, chasing the lone Russian near the trees. Upon hearing the sound of the threat, the Moscow soldier took a grenade from his pocket and denied the Ukrainians the opportunity to kill him. The Russians even tried using special covers to mask their body heat in front of the drone's thermal cameras. They crawled slowly through the fields in the darkness, but they were still hunted. There was no foolproof method. The drones worked to wipe out Russian boldness with gifts of fire. Moscow's armored vehicles did not stop advancing, supporting the infantry ahead like a living iron ear. They approached the Ukrainians, sometimes to fire their cannons, sometimes just to feed the front line with more bodies. The kamikazes from the 60 and 63 brigades went to action to halt the metallic march. Each armored vehicle, turned into a ball of fire, was celebrated with a breath of relief on days of mourning when the maps kept getting more and more colored by Russian advances at different points on the front. Even so, the kamikazes took off, determined to cut the enemy's momentum and stop, at least for a moment, the weight of the offensive. The problem for the drone operators was that, even relatively far from the front, they were still at risk. Both sides were always hunting the pilot squad and their bases. The Russians found one of these squads after following one of the Ukrainians' small bomber drones. With the coordinates, it was easy to permanently end the activities of those enemies. The Russians from the 2nd Artillery Brigade of the Southern Troop Group put their equipment to work against the Ukrainians in the villages. The houses were hit by shells fired from the cannons. The explosions were scattered throughout the neighborhood, searching for the hidden Ukrainian lives. Despite the destruction of the villages, most of the battles took place in the trenches. The soldiers tried to escape from the drones, each in their own way. A Russian tried to use a cloak to protect himself from being recorded by the thermal cameras. While resting, they were used even during the day. But at that moment, there was a spy in the sky watching his tactic. The kamikaze drone was called in to interrupt the Russians' rest. All he heard was the horrible buzzing in his nightmares before the explosion killed him. Arrived for the battles in this environment. He was with his companion Braddock, another Brazilian, this one born in Cascavel. He was another one who had a lot of experience in Ukraine. The two had decided to go together to the 60 Brigade. When they got there, they were selected for a mission because of their combat experience. They ended up separated, each assigned to a different defense group in advanced trenches. They set out at 2 in the morning, trying to avoid Russian attacks during the move. At first, it was supposed to be a 7 or 8 day mission. They were already used to that. Braddock and Harrison's positions were separated by about 900 meters. Between them, there was a minefield. Neither of them liked the trenches, which were almost completely covered. Despite the protection, they made it much harder for them to see the enemy. After the forest burned around them, they took the opportunity to open a hole so they could at least get a little view of the battlefield. The days went by and Harrison noticed that there was a lot wrong there. He could practically hear the Russians in the positions ahead. He had never seen so many, so close in his 3 years in Ukraine. There was no more defense ahead of him, contrary to what he had been told. Only the Brazilian, a Ukrainian about 30 years old, and another about 55, made up the first line of defense. He heard the Russians riding motorcycles in the area more and more. The sounds were way too close. The Russians had improved the use of motorcycles in the war to quickly move their assault squads to the trenches. Often close to the defenses, they would enter quickly and start the attack against the Ukrainian forces, who hadn't even noticed their arrival amid the noise of the shelling. Then, if they didn't take position, they had to escape, running the risk of being chased by drones. The tactic had its success rate, but also a high mortality rate. Sometimes an entire group was found by the observer drones long before they reached the trenches. The kamikazes were already flying against this threat before they could reach the Ukrainian defenses. The explosions caused shrapnel wounds and fall injuries on rough terrain but did not kill anyone. Harrison wasn't noticing this drone action against the Russians. In fact, he wasn't noticing any drone activity at all. The days were passing. It was impressive how absent the Ukrainian drones were and how the Russians were constantly present, trying their assaults. And one afternoon, they finally arrived. They moved across the destroyed terrain, trying to surprise the Brazilian and the Ukrainians. It seemed like it would be easy, but the older Ukrainian heard them first. He raised his AK and started shooting. The fight didn't last long. but it was fierce as he took the Russian's life. Ian saw how the Russian presence seemed like a parade on the theater of war. They even fired at the threats, driving some of them away. The first week went by, and with it, the food that ours didn't have. They were supposed to be resupplied by drones, but not even water arrived. There simply weren't any Ukrainian flights over them, maybe because of Russian electronic interference. The soldier looked up at the sky, asking for divine help, since human help seemed to no longer come. His comrades were increasingly worried, but they didn't have many options at the moment. Days went by, and his dry throat made communication increasingly difficult. He had to quench his thirst with his own urine while trying to keep his strength, as he could hear Russian explosions around him. His birthday was approaching, and with each passing day, he wished to be able to celebrate one more year of life. The messages on the radio had no answers for hunger or thirst. At the beginning of the evening, the Russians came. The clock showed 7:20 in the evening, and it still wasn't completely dark. The enemies moved across the destroyed terrain, trying to surprise the Ukrainians. Harrison heard the sound of someone jumping into the trench and asked who it was. He heard the reply that they were allies bringing water. The relief lasted only a fraction of a second because one of the Ukrainians warned that in fact they were Russian. The enemies were intercepting the Ukrainians' radio signals and knew how the defenses were weakened by hunger and thirst. The grenades came shortly after. The first explosion heated up the trench and cleared the way for the Russians' AK-12 gunfire. The older Ukrainian was shot in the first seconds of battle. Harrison didn't even have time to react. The other trench mate hit, terrified by the sudden attack. Suddenly, one of the Russians was already in front of him, making the AK roar in constant bursts. The shots streaked across the dug-up earth, hit the wood, flew through the darkness, seeking Harrison's life. He heard the whistling of the bullets amid the prayers running through his mind. Only 2 bullets grazed his hand. Shortly after, another grenade exploded. One of the fragments flew and entered the Brazilian's left eye. Bleeding, he retreated as much as he could, positioning himself with the remaining Ukrainian in a hole. The Brazilian reacted by shooting at the Russian silhouette. One of the shots went through the enemy's body, causing him to retreat wounded. The Russians demanded that they come out. They made threats, but got no response. In addition to gunfire, they decided to seal the trench with dirt and sandbags. The 2 defenders were trapped in the dark. Gradually, the Ukrainian calmed down and bandaged the Brazilian's hands. He reminded Harrison that there was a way out. The Russians weren't at the back of the trench, exactly where the forest fire had happened, and there was no protection against the assault or to set up an ambush. They were digging the hole in that direction to start their escape. The Ukrainian started gathering his equipment, but he was taking too long. Disoriented by his injuries and the impact of the grenades, Allison went ahead. He got lost in the field, unaware of the mines, just a few meters from his feet. It took him a while to realize he was heading in the wrong direction. He stopped for an hour, hiding in a bush, until he regained full awareness and prevented fear from continuing to kill his reason and the instincts he had developed during the war. He heard the Ukrainian radio, then the sound of soldiers' footsteps, and then the mention of the nickname Parakeet. He ran toward the sounds, whistling loudly, even though he was almost voiceless from dehydration. The soldiers heard him and found him, leading him to a safe position. The pain weakened him, but he knew he couldn't stop. He was evacuated at 2 in the morning, but he still had to walk 2 kilometers to consider himself completely safe. Son went through 4 surgeries, each one marked by the pain of flesh torn by the shrapnel that had wounded him. Among them, a delicate operation on his eye, a tense procedure in which every second seemed to hang between light and darkness. Even so, the doctors told him that another intervention would be inevitable. It was a miracle to be alive and, above all, not to have fallen into eternal blindness. When he saw the size of the grenade shrapnel that had been in his eye, he was grateful for many miracles. On that day, he was attacked by Spetsnaz, the Russian special forces. Afterwards, he escaped through a route he never imagined would help him, and still, his feet avoided all the dangers of nearly a kilometer of minefield.